So very good to see you this morning, to be together as we study God's Word together. I thought I would come down here and speak this morning, so I won't have to negotiate the stairs a couple of times. Just take that right out of the factor there. So glad we could be here this morning. I was told I have about 45 minutes. I usually only speak about 25, 30 minutes. So I'm going to have to do that preacher thing where we stretch. So we'll see what we can do. May have some extra time left over. If maybe you have some questions of the things that we'll talk about this morning, or maybe if you were here Friday or Saturday, some things that were said during those lessons, I'd be happy to answer those questions, because I know we'll have some time left over, maybe even 10 minutes when we get done. So if you think of something, please, we'll ask. If you want to ask those questions, I know John Duvall will be happy to answer those for you. So, all right, if you will, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, do I have a, there we go. Oh. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 12. There the Apostle Paul says, 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 12, "For our boast is this, the testimony is our conscience, that we behave in the world with simplicity and godly sincerity, not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God, and supremely so towards you." I want to think a little bit about the conscience. I want you to think carefully about these situations that I'm going to give you in just a moment. Think about where you fit in these scenarios. I'm glad we have our young people with us this morning, because these directly affect you as well. Think about this. Some of your co-workers, after work one day, ask you to go with them to eat, go out to eat. You know, these people you work with, you know, you want to be on the team with them, and they're headed to the restaurant, you want to go with them, they're going to watch the game on the big screen TVs they have some laughs, have a good time. You want to go with them. Certainly seems like a fun thing to do, and so you got to ask, well, which restaurant, where are we headed? And the answer to that question is, they're going to one of those restaurants where the waitress is dressed in very, very skimpy attire. Great buy on hot wings, though. Great hot wings. Lots of TVs. Going to be lots and lots of fun. What about that? You're thinking about that. Doesn't that just sound like fun? It will be fun. And I mean, maybe you're married, but I mean, it doesn't hurt after all to look at pretty girls every now and then. It's like not like any of them is ever going to start anything with you anyways. How can you have an influence on people? How can you be a good influence if you're all the time Mr. Goody Two-Shoes? You know, don't want to go anywhere, don't want to do anything with anybody. I mean, this surely sounds like fun, and you feel like you ought to kind of do it and kind of go. I mean, trying to work with these people. But of course, in the back of your mind, your conscience is sounding an alarm, isn't it? Your conscience is telling you something that I really shouldn't be doing. What about this scenario? Maybe you have a young couple. Maybe they're in their senior year of high school, or maybe just beginning college, and they sure do love each other an awful lot. And then one afternoon, when nobody is at the house, one kiss leads to another, which leads to another, and suddenly this thing has become much more physical than we intended them to be, but it just feels very good. And it feels like the right thing to do, because after all, we love each other so much, we want to be intimate with each other, but our conscience is not happy where all this is going. Or how about this scenario? There's a friend, maybe at school or at work again, and they've invited you to go to church with them. You invited them to go to church with you, maybe to the gospel meeting. And they come and they go with you to the gospel meeting, and then they say, okay, now it's your turn. You go to church with me now. And so there's a time, maybe on a Saturday night, they're going to have a service, and you decide, okay, I'll go with them. I'll reciprocate this. So you go with them, and you arrive at the service, and you find the preacher has a message from the Bible, and what he says sounds pretty good. He makes some pretty good application there. He begins to talk about the things, and things get to be flowing, and the worship is going, and things are getting really spiritual. Now the praise band strikes up a driving beat. People began to sway, stand, raise their hands back and forth. Suddenly someone falls out on the ground, and the preacher says they've been slain in the Spirit. And it just feels good. People are shouting and jumping around, and the tempo increases, and so does the intensity, and folks are saying, let go and let God. It feels really spiritual, really amazing. You've never been in a kind of worship like that before. Now you're wondering if you should let go and let God too, but your conscience is saying, something's not right here. In all those scenarios, what we feel like doing and what our conscience wants us to do are directly at odds with each other. There's that C word again I mentioned a moment ago, conscience, that conscience word. In verse 12 here of 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talks about the conscience. He says, for our boast is this, the testimony of our conscience. What do I mean by conscience? What does Paul mean by conscience? Conscience is, one writer says, that an inner witness that testifies on the righteousness or wrongness of a rightness or wrongness of one's actions or motives, and on the basis of them pronounces judgment concerning the worth of the person. I think that's right. Our conscience is an awareness inside of us that judges whether what we are doing is in harmony with what we believe to be right. And Paul says in verse 12 of 1 Corinthians, in verse 12, I don't know if it's the next slide or not. Let me go back with slide, back to that verse. In verse 12, Paul says that his conscience, his inner voice, his inner witness, if you will, testified that he did the right thing. Now, that doesn't mean that he did the right thing. Paul was very aware of that. But it certainly did mean, while there is a difference in our subjective conscience and objective truth, it certainly did mean that he was at least living in line with what his conscience told him to do. Well, what do? When we don't want to listen to our old conscience anymore? What do? How do we cope with wanting to do wrong? The feelings that come that this time doing wrong would really be okay because really, after all, it isn't all that wrong. Or because this is a very gray area over here. Or any of the million other justifications that suddenly come to mind to block the conscience, block that quiet voice inside of us that says, don't do it. Don't do this. This morning we are continuing this series on Christian living. And I want to talk with you about the dangers of listening to our feelings. But I also want to talk about some things that we can do to help us. That can help us when our conscience is saying one thing and our feelings are saying something completely different. I want to set before you 4 things this morning. 4 things that we need to work with in that very scenario. My goal this morning is to make you very aware that there is danger in listening to what our feelings are telling us, and that it just won't work listening to our feelings. And I want to do that by picking this podium up and putting it in the front line of temptation this morning. I want us to put ourselves right there. I want this to be very real world oriented. I want to engage temptation just head on. And I want to talk about what the Bible says we need to do when we really want to do what is wrong, but our conscience is telling us we better do what is right. I want to talk about 4 things that can help us in that scenario. First of all, the first thing we need to realize is that despite what our feelings are telling us, if our conscience is bothering us, it does so for a good reason. There's a good reason why our conscience bothers us. And I feel sometimes that we've talked so much about how the conscience is not our perfect guide, the conscience is not our guide. We've railed against Jiminy Cricket and for his singing his little song, let your conscience be your guide, let your conscience be your guide, always let your conscience be your guide. We've talked about how our conscience can be seared, and we've talked so much about how conscience is not an infallible guide that I think sometimes folks have decided, well, conscience, who needs that? That's a waste of time. It's not good for anything. But that's not right. In Acts 24, here are the words of Paul again. In Acts 24, look at what Paul says about conscience. In Acts 24 and verse 16, Paul says, I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Paul valued his conscience and lived in a certain kind of way that his conscience would be clear. In fact, I want to add to that verse what he says in Romans 14. In Romans, the 14th chapter, here, this chapter that deals with some matters of conscience. And I want you to notice at the end of that chapter, as Paul begins to sum up all of these principles, he says in verse 23 here, Paul says very clearly, hey, don't be violating your conscience. In Romans 14:23, he says, whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats. And he's talking here about the matter of eating some meat that was questionable, and it wasn't because it had been sitting on the counter too long and maybe tainted. That's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about meat that had been sacrificed to idols. Can I eat that? Paul says, well, if you have some pangs about the conscience about doing it, don't do it. Whoever, verse 23, has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith. For whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. Paul did not want people to run roughshod over that inner voice that we have. He did not want that awareness that judges our actions by our moral standards to be extinguished. It functions, he says, to help us serve the Lord and to keep us on track. Of course, the key to that is our conscience is only going to be as good as the information we give it. That's the case. Only as good as what we give it. But that does not mean at all then, of course. That doesn't mean that if I'm getting squirmy about something, if I'm feeling uncomfortable with something, if my conscience is making me uncomfortable, I should ask myself, why is that happening? Where did that information come from that's in my conscience that's causing my conscience to object to that course that I'm pursuing? Let me be clear. If your conscience is afflicting you, the reason it's afflicting you is it's your fault. It's your fault. You programmed it, if you will. You programmed your conscience by what you put into it. You're the one who got some information from the Bible, maybe from mom and dad growing up and telling you of your values and what you should be doing and what you should not be doing, and from the preacher on Sunday morning or from a bulletin. Somewhere you got some information about right and wrong and you wrote it into your conscience, and you told your conscience, if I do this, this is wrong. So, if your conscience is sounding the alarm, shouldn't we at least ask why? Why is that the case? How did that information get in there? Where did that information come from? It came from me. So why did I train my conscience to object to that? There's a Christian we know back home, Alabama. And sometimes the members of the church there on New Year's, one of the members there has all the families over to their house for New Year's, kind of celebrate the New Year together. And they do so, we get together and we have some food, but they also have a rook tournament. They talk about the rook tournament all year long. Who's going to be the champion of the rook tournament? And there's one who she can't do it. She can't go and be part of that. She knows nothing wrong with them, but her mom had told her all her life, playing cards is bad. All cards are bad, evil, the devil. And she can't get that out of her head. It's her conscience. Her conscience is telling her that. She trained it that way from the information she got. Now, can you give your conscience bad information? Sure you can. Sure you can. Paul deals with that in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 9, and 10. We won't turn there this morning, but those three chapters, 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, deal with that. Just because your conscience is hollering about things, just because it's sounding off, doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. I may have trained my conscience poorly. But let's just think about something else, though. If my conscience does go off, that would mean that at some point in time, either when I wasn't under the pressure of sin, when I wasn't around a bunch of my peers who were enticing and pulling on me to do what is wrong, when I wasn't feeling that peer pressure, when I wasn't caught up in the rush of emotions, at some point in my life, in the cold light of day, maybe when I was around good and godly people, when I wasn't being swept along by peer pressure and all kinds of emotions, when I was thinking clearly, I wrote this into my conscience. So what has happened now to cause me to decide that my conscience needs to be retuned a little bit? And usually the answer is, of course, nothing. Nothing at all. When Martin Luther was tried for heresy before the Roman Catholic Church, when he was urged to recant his attacks on the Pope and Roman Catholicism, this is what he said. He said, my conscience is captive to the Word of God. To go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Mr. Luther understood the need to listen to his conscience. And I would suggest this morning that you and I, we need to do the same. We need to listen to our conscience and what it's telling us. Secondly, if we don't, that's going to lead to the second area about our feelings. I need to ask myself, do I want to be a prisoner to my feelings? Do I want to be a slave to my feeling? That's the alternative. I will not listen to my conscience. I will do whatever my feelings tell me to do. And of course, for many people, that's exactly how they live. Not just some of the time, pretty much all the time, that's how they live. If they want to say something, they just say it. Hey, keep it inside, you know. You got to vent. You got to tell it like it is. If they want to do something, they just do it. If it feels good, do it. If it harms somebody else, well, you just quit your whining about that. If it's morally wrong, who are you to judge me? I'm going to do what I want, whatever I want, however I feel like it, I will do it. And of course, if they don't feel like doing something, they don't do that either. Saying I didn't feel like it, to them is sufficient excuse not going to the club to exercise, but also apparently not getting up and going to church too. They're both one and the same. Many people are led and guided by their feelings. Many folks think that's not only the right way to live, it's the only way to live. The only way to really live free. Really be a free person. Just do whatever you want to do, however you feel like it at that moment. Of course, the Bible tells us quite clearly that such is not free. That's not freedom. It is slavery. It's being enslaved to your whims and desires. I'm going to turn to the Old Testament now, the book of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 17, as Jeremiah talked with the people of God, he tried to encourage them to return to the truth, to what is objectively right, rather than just following every fancy and every desire of the moment. In Jeremiah 17 and verse 9, Jeremiah identifies here for us the trouble with following your feelings. Jeremiah 17 and verse 9, he says here, Jeremiah 17 and verse 9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? At one point in life, all of us understood the truth of Jeremiah 17 and verse 9. All of us did, even in our lives. When I was in high school, I can remember feeling very, very strongly about a girl I was dating at that time. I just knew, man, she was the one. She was the one for me. No doubt about it. I could just feel it. She wasn't. She wasn't the one for me. But I just knew it. It just felt so right. Didn't make any difference. Didn't make any difference. I can remember feeling so strongly, just as strongly, in fact, that what I wanted to do when I grew up was be a dentist. I wanted to be a dentist. I have no idea why I wanted to be. I wanted to be a dentist. I can tell you, you should know that I am prone to passing out at the sight of blood. That would have been real interesting. Real interesting. But it just felt so right. All of us have had similar experiences like that. We just feel like this is so right. We just feel like this was the way to go. We feel like there was no other choice. There wasn't anything else that we could do. No doubt, no looking back, couldn't be any other way. This is it, and we all know it's it. But yet we look back on those moments with retrospect, and we realize we were wrong. We were completely fooled by our feelings, because feelings were and are subject to our emotions, our lust, our whims, our desires, and every other failing that we have. Feelings are a terrible guide for decision making, and we all know that. And then we get into a key situation of right and wrong, and suddenly we're going to use our feelings as an infallible compass for life. Why is it? We say sayings about, well, he's too close to the situation. Maybe it's someone who's dealing with a problem or an issue and he needs to be more objective. He's too close to it because he's got feelings about it. And his feelings are clouding his judgment with what he needs to be doing is right and wrong. Feelings, we all know, are terrible compasses for our life because feelings lead to slavery. That's what it is to being enslaved to self. Because when I do that, what I'm saying is, I'm the only one that matters. I am the king. And how I feel is all important. And I tell you, that's a mighty intoxicating place to be. A place that is utterly disconnected from any sort of objective standard. Conscience may not be a perfect guide, but at least in some ways, at least it's based outside of us. It's based on our knowledge of what we receive from the Word of God, out of our knowledge that someone else has given us, either our mom or our dad or someone we trust. They have given us this information. In some ways, conscience is external to self, but feelings are certainly not outside of self. They're right here. They're inside of me. Feelings are right there, inside of us. All about me and not anything else. No one else. It wouldn't take too long if you scan through your Bible to find people who live just like that, lived in their feelings, and because of so made themselves out to be colossal spiritual failures. Time would escape us to talk about men like Samson or King Saul or Esau, who all gave in to their feelings, and it turned out to be wrong. You read those stories and you find that they did whatever they felt like. They made the biggest messes you ever saw. The truth is, the more I follow my feelings, the more I'll want to follow my feelings. And I will spiral downward doing more and more what I want to do with a reckless disregard for anybody else and, of course, what's right. That means when I feel strongly that I want to do something that my conscience is telling me is wrong, I need to think, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen if I do listen to my feelings? Look over in 2 Samuel 11. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, I have the verses on the PowerPoint here. I always try when I can to put the verses on the PowerPoint. Some have a hard time turning pages, or when you're wrestling little ones, it's hard to turn the pages. So I try to put it there, but it's really good to hear pages turning, to see for yourself that these things are here. PowerPoint could be wrong. Bible's not going to be wrong. 2 Samuel 12, verse 1. I'm sorry, 2 Samuel 11 and verse 1. Can't even say it right. 2 Samuel 11 and verse 1. Notice here, 2 Samuel 11 and verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Amorites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house. He saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is that not Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" I want you to notice David is standing on top of the palace. He's looking down at Bathsheba. And he had, of course, strong feelings for her, feelings of lust and desire. It's hard for me to imagine that David's conscience didn't say something about that, didn't say something about what he was contemplating, or even what he went about and did. Bathsheba was another man's wife, and the adultery that followed, and the cover-up, and the lies, and the murder, they were all wrong. I tell you, David being a man after God's own heart, I believe his conscience just ate him alive about that. I believe with good reason. In fact, from David's own words in Psalm 32, David writes about this sin. This is what he's talking about here. And this is what he says about this in this time when he was hiding the sin and when he was involved in sin and trying to cover all this up. Notice what he says about that. In Psalm 32 and verse 3, he says, "For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer." David says, I was miserable because my conscience was there constantly at my side saying, "David, you did wrong. David, this was wrong. David." In fact, look again in Psalm 51. In Psalm 51, again, David writes about this sin again. In Psalm 51 and verse 3, he says, "I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me." Everywhere I look, David says, my conscience is there saying, you did wrong, David. David. Verse 12. He goes on, chapter 51, verse 12. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and uphold me with a willing spirit. Look what David felt after sin. Look what David's conscience did. He listened to his feelings. He felt like calling for Bathsheba. His feelings urged him to give in and sin with her. He listened to those feelings. And what happened was, he went away from God. And he found himself in the lowly depths of sin. I tell you, that's the part that we have trouble with. When people come to the elders and ask for spiritual counsel, or they come to a preacher, usually they say things like, I want to talk about the situation I'm in. And what they say is, I'm in this funny situation, or I'm not exactly clear here on how all this works out. But nobody ever says, I'll tell you what, there's the situation that I'm just in, it's just as wrong as can be. It's wrong as can be. But it would feel really good to get involved in this sin. And I know I'm going to hate myself just as soon as it's over, but I've never done that before. And I've always wanted to do that. I just really want to sin. So what I'm asking you is, preacher, can you help me justify this sin? It's not what people say, is it? But we need to be candid. We need to be honest. If I listen to my feelings in this circumstance, I will sin. For example, what about going to that restaurant where the waitresses are scantily clad? There's no justification for that, is there? Christians do not embrace lust. And how could we possibly have any influence with anybody for Jesus Christ in the way of light and purity when we're involved in that? James 1:27 tells us we need to be abstaining from the stain of worldliness. We know that. All of us know that. There is no excuse for going and being in such a place. Well, what about that couple that were thinking seriously about fornication? Same song, second verse, no justification for that. That's wrong. No time for that. Not some of the time, not any time, not all the time. 100% of the time, Christians are told to flee sexual immorality, 1 Corinthians 6. Can't make justifications for that. Not at all. And what about going someplace and worshiping in a way that's outside the pattern of the New Testament? Same song, third verse. Doesn't matter how it feels, does it? If it's not according to the Scriptures, it's vain. It's vain worship. It isn't pleasing unto God, and there's no excuse for participating in that. In all of those situations, and all the millions of situations that you can possibly imagine and find yourself in your life, the hard truth is that my feelings, your feelings, will not change what is wrong into something that is right. When our conscience is telling us, whoa, buddy, hey, this is sinful, there's nothing we can do to change that outcome and make it right. It's still going to be sin. In fact, Paul's admonition that we read at the end of Romans 14 that forbade us to violate our conscience says, even if we are mistaken, and it would really be all right to do this, but since I believed it was wrong, since my conscience is afflicting me, for me it is wrong. And if I violate my conscience, I have sinned. What's going to happen if I listen to my feelings? I will sin. I'll sin against the Lord, period. Finally, I really need to ask myself, shouldn't I do the right thing here? Even if I don't feel like it. That really is important for us to deal with because more and more feelings are becoming dominant in our society. And people are wanting to be at a place where they not only do the right thing, but they want to feel like doing the right thing. But they want that. But sometimes people will say, well, I just didn't feel like it, so I didn't because, I didn't want to be a hypocrite. I want to be clear. I think there's some basis for that. We want to, 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5, Paul says we want to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And our married couples here this morning, they will tell you in a minute, won't they? If there was a spouse, if their spouse were to say to them, I really want to commit adultery, but I'm not going to do that because that would be wrong. But I'd want to. That wouldn't work, would it? there'd be some problems in that relationship. It's not going to fly. We not only want our spouses to physically do what the right thing, we want them to want to do the right thing. Let's be clear. In the cauldron of temptation, how we feel is not the issue. The issue is obedience. That's the issue. In Luke 5, I love the story in Luke 5. Peter was, you remember, Peter before preaching the gospel was a professional fisherman. Jesus Christ was not. In Luke 5, the guy who was not a fisherman said, "Boys, let's go fishing." And it was pretty obvious to Peter and his partners that this wasn't a good day to be fishing. They knew fish. They knew fishing. They'd fished on the Sea of Galilee all their lives. They knew where the fish were, how to get the fish, what time to go fishing, and this wasn't the time. It wasn't going to work. And so Peter just flat out says in Luke 5 and verse 5, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. Carpenter, this is not the good conditions for fishing." Look what Peter says then. "But at your word, I'll let down the net. I'm going to do what you tell me to do. Whether I feel like it or not, I will follow your word." In Romans 12, notice the order, the sequencing of events here in Romans 12. Romans 12 and verse 2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Please notice there at the first comes action there. Do not be conformed. And then follows the attitude, renew your mind. You want to feel like doing the right thing, but sometimes the way to feel like doing the right thing is to do the right thing, and the feelings will follow. Isn't that what Joseph did? Joseph, when Potiphar's wife approached him, Joseph didn't wait. Joseph didn't rationalize. Joseph, he got out of there. He understood that timing is very important, and sometimes the longer we stare at temptation, and the longer we think about it, and the more excuses come to our minds, and to try to shut the conscience down, and we'll do what we feel like doing. Don't worry about your feelings, just do what's right. Feelings will follow later. In the moment of temptation, trying to fix our feelings may take too long, and may not even happen. But what can happen is that we can get away from sin before it takes us over. I'll worry about the feelings later. Right now, I'm going to obey God first. Now, without any question, that's not an exhaustive list about our feelings. We could say a whole lot more about our feelings. In fact, we didn't say anything about trust. Trust that God will provide us the way of escape. That's a pretty good thing to add to that list. Or what about understand that we are responsible for our own actions before God? We're responsible for what we do. No excusing it. No rationalization. That'd be good for us to add to that list. But I do think these four things we've talked about this morning, I think will crystallize for us precisely what we need to think about, so we can act and decisively determined to do what is right, rather than forever be held captive to our ever-changing feelings. When I feel like sinning, and my conscience says, "Aaron, don't do it. Don't do it." I hope and pray that these things in the Lord help us to follow our conscience and stay away from sin. That's it. How am I on time? 5 minutes. I did pretty good. 5 minutes. Questions, comments? All right.
The one thing that you could kind of elaborate a little bit more on is what happens to our conscience when we continually beat it down.
When we continually beat it down and don't listen to our conscience. Well, as we said before, your conscience is only as good as what you put into it. And so if we've trained our conscience one way and it's bothering us and we beat it down and we go against our conscience, again, that does retune our conscience. It does retune it to something that is not acceptable to God. And so we can beat it down and train it in the wrong way. Yeah. Our conscience is only as good as what we put into it.
Well, more we ignore it, the more we kind of running the hot iron over it.
Yeah, yeah.
Toughen it up.
Right, right. Yeah, that's right.
There's my help.
Thanks. Go ahead.
I would think something from the opposite spectrum about how feelings or emotions fuel negative behavior, but on the other end, different emotions can fuel positive, righteous behavior. Things like compassion
Sure.
that fuels your desire to help others, hospitality, love, things like that.
Right, right. Yes. Yes, there's a positive aspect, absolutely. And that's good to point out. Anything else? All right. Well, they're still having Bible class, so y'all keep it down. Thank you so much. Huh?